Greetings, family. This is IMAHKÜS Njinga Okofu Ababio, affectionately known as Mama IMAHKÜS. I invite you to continue on the journey with me. Returning home ain't easy, but it sure is a blessing. But I also invite you to come and visit with us in Rwanda, the country of 1,000 hills. But like I said before, they lied. It's 2,000 hills. 2,000 hills, up and down, and I live on a mountain. Committing myself to completing this podcast. First of all, I want to say Happy New Day to everyone. I hope that all of you are as happy as I am today. I mean, I wake up so happy, blessed that here I am at this stage of my existence, having been blessed with 32 rounds, nope, not 32, 33. I even forget how old I am, okay? And it really doesn't matter because age is just a number that identifies the point in time that we came into this existence. So I thank the ancestors, I thank the universe, I thank the Most High for the blessings that have been bestowed upon me, for good health and strength. I just came from the gym working out, and I'm real proud of myself this morning because there are about 60 young people. I belong to this gym, well, two in fact, the Ribeiro Sports Club I belong to, and I'm the eldest person there. So they had some competition going this morning, and it was, you had to think, you had to pay attention. And anytime the leader called out, red, you had to step on red, blue, you had to step on blue. And she would go blue, red, blue, red, blue, blue, blue. So when you're not paying attention, she say blue and you move over to the red. So like I said, there's about 60 of us doing that this morning. And I was the last man standing. So I felt like, yeah, okay. I looked at all these young people in front of me, and I was the last man standing. There was some guy behind me. I looked back, and I saw this guy there. It's just the two of us. And she started going fast. Blue, blue, red, red. I was like, on it. So I'm blessed, really. But that's not what we're here for today. I just wanted to share a little bit of my morning with you. And the gym is not around the corner. I had to walk quite a distance to get to the gym, and then I had to walk back home because I'm not riding a bike. Everybody here rides, the moto, zoom, zoom, zoom. I can't do that. That's just not enough vehicle under my butt, okay? If it don't have four wheels, I can't deal with it. But I'm happy to be in front of you, as I said. I've been trying to do this for a while. But this is a audio reading of my book, Returning Home Ain't Easy. And we're probably going to infuse in that stories from Ababio. And Ababio means he or she, I added the she, who was away and has returned. And as I said, it's a 21st century anthology of African diasporan returnees to Ghana. Quite interesting. And I've been called the way shower. I came to Ghana in 1987, and people have followed me for years. I look up, somebody's coming through the door. in saying things like, "You're the reason that I'm in Africa." That makes me feel real proud because I asked the ancestors for what I had living in Africa. And what I had to do is share it. As always, I have to give honor, praise, and glory to my mother, father, creators, and to the memory of my great African ancestors whose shoulders I stand upon, whose backs I lean upon, and whose shoulders have held me up until this day. And I can't forget a very special person in my life, Nana Akofu Itri Kweku the first Ababio. Nana was made a chief in our village. Oh, those are our dogs. Okay, that's my, those are our guard dogs. We have 4, believe it or not, 4 Rhodesian Ridgebacks. Okay, so you know I'm gonna hit them dogs in the head with a stick, right? I'm gonna beat them. Okay. But like I said, I want to, I have to pay homage to my king man, who has been with me for many, many, many years. At least we were together for about 35 years before he transitioned in 2007. But he was there for me. He was there with me. That's why he's on the cover of my book, okay? So I'm going to start out with the introduction of Returning Home Ain't Easy, but it sure is a blessing. Ahead of us loomed this enormous, foreboding structure. That sight caused me to tremble. I almost didn't want to go inside. The outer walls were dingy white, chipped, faded, and moldy. The sea had eaten away some of the mortar. It was gray and dismal as we climbed the steep steps, following the sign leading to the reception area. When we entered the reception area of the Cape Coast Castle dungeons, a smallish man with a bright smiling face met us. His name was Mr. Owusu, and he had been working there as a receptionist and sometimes guide for many years. Mr. Owusu, his name was Mr. Owusu, and he had been working there at the castle dungeons as a guide sometimes for many years. After introductions were made all around, Mr. Owusu, our guide, began the tour around the castle. Entering the inner part of the castle overlooking a large courtyard, our guide gave us the background history of the Cape Coast Castle dungeons. This was one of the more than 60 castle dungeons, forts, and lodges that local rulers, the chieftaincy, and stretched for 300 miles. Crap, that's wrong. This was one of more than 60 castle dungeons, forts, and lodges that had been constructed by European traders with the permission of local rulers, the chieftaincy. And they stretched for 300 miles along the west coast of Africa to store captured Africans until a shipload of enslaved Africans could be assembled for shipment to the west. Unbelievably, 27 of those houses of misery were located in Ghana. Various European oppressors had occupied the Cape Coast Castle dungeons during the transatlantic European slave trade. It began with the Portuguese in the 1500s, followed by the Dutch, then the Swedes, then the Danes, and finally the English, who occupied it in 1665. It remained under their control, serving as the seat of the British administration in the Gold Coast, Cape Coast, until they relocated their racist regime to the Christian Board Castle in Accra, Ghana in 1877. Our next step was the Palaver Hall, which means talking or discussing, the meeting place of slave merchants, which also served as a hall used in auctioning off our ancestors. The room was huge, the only light coming from the windows which lined both sides of the walls, one side facing the ocean, the other side overlooking the town. A bare room echoing the voice of our guide, a haunting echo which reverberated off the walls as the guide explained how they bargained and sold us. When slave auctions were not going on in Palaver Hall, which was used also as a marketing place for the governor, chiefs, and other visitors. We then moved on to the governor's apartment and the church, which I felt like burning down. But nothing could prepare me for what we would experience next. We descended the stairs into a large cobblestone courtyard and walked through large double wooden doors which led into a long, dark, damp tunnel. The stench of musty bodies, fear and death hung in the air. There was no noise except the thunderous crushing of the waves against the outer walls and the roaring sound of the water. Deeper we walked into large, dark rooms which had served as a warehouse for enslaved African people, awaiting shipment to the Americas and the Caribbean. This was the men's dungeon. As we stood in that large, cavernous room, the air was still. The little ventilation that was available came from small openings near the 20-foot-high ceilings. Our ancestors had been kept underground, chained to the walls and each other, making escape impossible. The mood of the group was hushed as several people started crying. We were standing in the hellholes of the most horrific conditions imaginable. There were no words to express the suffering that must have gone on in these dungeons. I became caught up, thrown back in time. I was suddenly one of the many who were shackled, beaten, and starved. But I was one of the fortunate souls to have survived the forced exodus from their homelands to be sold, branded, and thrown into those hellholes, meant to hold 600 people, but which held more than 1,000 captured men at one time. The men separated from the women as they waited shipment to the Americas. According to our guide, the chalk marks on the walls of the men's dungeon indicated the level of the floor prior to the excavation of the floor, which had been built up over years of slavery with feces, bones, filth, and whatever else. As the guide continued to describe the horror of these pits of hell, I began to shake violently. I needed to get out of there. I was being smothered. I turned and ran up the steep incline of the tunnel to the castle courtyards. The winds from the sea whipping my face, bringing me back to the present. I couldn't believe what I had just experienced. How could anyone be so cruel and inhuman? Following the guide, we proceeded across the massive courtyard and down another passageway to the women's dungeon, a smaller version of the men's dungeon, but not so deep underground. It had held over 300 women at any given time. As we entered that dark, musty, damp room, the sound of crashing waves was like muffled rolling thunder. A dimly lit, uncovered light bulb hung from the ceiling on a thin, frayed wire. After standing silently for a time in this tomb, the guide began to lead the group out I was the last person left in the room when the guide turned and said he was continuing the tour. "Please," I said, "I'm not ready to leave. Just turn off the light for me, and I will join the group shortly." As the group walked away silently, the tears would not stop flowing. I dropped to my knees, trembling and crying even harder. With the light off, the only light in that dungeon came through one small window near the very high ceiling, reflecting down as though it were a muted spotlight. Darkness hung in every corner. As I rocked back and forth on the dirt floor, I could hear weeping and wailing, anguished screams coming from the distance. Suddenly, the room was packed with women, some naked, some with babies, some sick and laying in the dirt, while others laid against the walls around the dungeons. Terror filled their faces. "My God, what have we done to wind up here crammed together like animals?" Pain and suffering raked their bodies, a look of hopelessness and despair on their faces, but with a strong will to survive. "Oh God, what have we done to deserve this kind of treatment?" Cold terror gripped my body. Tears blinded me, and the screams wouldn't stop. As I sat there violently weeping, I began to feel a sense of warmth. Many hands were touching my body, caressing me, smoothing me, soothing me, as a calmness began to come over me. I began to feel almost safe as voices whispered in my ears, assuring me that everything was all right. "Don't cry," they said. "You've come home. You've returned to your homeland to reopen the door of no return." Gradually, the voices and the women faded into the darkness. It was then that I realized that some of the screams I'd heard were my own. The eerie light beaming down from the window was growing dimmer as day began fading into night. As I got up from the dungeon floor, I knew that I would never be the same again. After years of wandering and searching, I had finally found home, and one day I wouldn't be leaving again. The book that you hold in your hands, Returning Home Ain't Easy, but It Sure Is a Blessing, speaks to the visions of our ancestors and demonstrates the efforts, both positive and negative, the humor, the tears, and the frustrations of a diasporan African family, diligently working and struggling within the blessings of being back in our ancestral homeland. It faces the startling realities plagued by those of us who are trying to return home. Realities of the fact that many of our continental-born brothers and sisters have very little knowledge of the African people born and raised in the diaspora that resulted from the transatlantic Arab-European slave trade. Ironically, every Ghanaian we spoke with wanted to go to the United States. We were coming, and they wanted to go. We were like ships in the night, passing each other unseeing and uncaring. My story contrasts these with those realities of life on the other side. Brothers struggling to survive were being killed on a regular basis while driving taxis in New York City. A few years before we repatriated to Ghana, 2 men held up my husband with a shotgun while he was working his taxi. When they entered the cab and sat down, the man with the gun spoke no English, put it to my husband's head, as the other man announced in broken English, "This is a stuck-up. Don't turn around or you dead, man." They then tied and bound him before throwing him in the trunk of his taxi. Riding around the Bronx and Manhattan, they ended up dumping him on a dark street in the early morning. at a deserted terminal market in the Bronx. They ordered him to stay still and not move for 15 minutes. Thank God he was unhurt that time. But what about next time? Certainly no one could doubt there would be a next time, the way things were happening in New York City. Children were being gunned down playing in the streets and playgrounds. Safety was a problem even in the school system. These chaotic conditions, among other problems, caused us to run like hell from New York, out of the United States and straight home to Africa. Here we found our family of 4 could live in comfort on my husband's pension from the New York City Fire Department. We set about pursuing economic empowerment for ourselves and the development and betterment of our African family on the continent. However, since arriving here, we have found that there are many jobs that are either reserved exclusively for Ghanaians or require certain monetary stipulations designed for big corporations. My husband, who owned and operated his own taxi car service in New York, would have to have a minimum of 10 cars to go into the car service business here. If we could afford to purchase 10 cars, would we need to open a car service? We owned our own travel agency in the United States, but in Ghana, we would have needed $60,000 operating capital and a Ghanaian partner, or $200,000 to do it alone. In the absence of that kind of upfront cash, we have had to call upon our God-given creativity. Returning home ain't easy chronicles how we maintained ourselves, reconnected with our extended family, developed business interests to secure a good future for our families while trying to make a worthwhile contribution to our community. It has been more than 10 years since our family had repatriated to Mother Africa, leaving behind mayhem, racism, creeping anarchy, bedlam, etc. That's not to say things aren't far from that or are perfect in Ghana. We've been tricked, accused of being racist, called O'Bruni, white man or foreigner, but we've also been loved and welcomed home by many of our Ghanaian brothers and sisters. They are anxious to learn about us as we are about them. Each of us wants to know who the other has become, who we have become while we were separated from our motherland. This healthy exchange makes a strong, strong bond between us. Together, we can set about correcting those wrongs committed against us and remember the strength and greatness of us as African people. Just as a 2-cord rope is stronger than a 1-cord rope, our knowledge of the truth of our separation from one another will enable us to go forward as a stronger, united African front, a power source to be reckoned with spiritually, economically, and politically. One of our great African leaders and statesmen, the late Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, first president of the Republic of Ghana from 1957 to 1966, said all people of African descent, whether they live in North or South America, the Caribbean, or in other parts of the world, are Africans and belong to the African nation. That being so, it is with the blessing and fulfillment of prophecy that we have returned home on the wings of the wind. Genesis 15, verse 13. And he said to Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. The biblical expression found in Revelations and true today as airplanes fly through the skies.